Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Through Ages. Before we begin, I'd love to hear where in the world you're listening from. So, wherever you are tonight, let's drift back 500 years to a time when maps still had blank spaces and empires filled them with dreams. Tonight we're following the long, fevered search for El Dorado, often imagined as a mad dash toward a shining city, but better understood as a slow, grinding system of debt, rumor, and survival, where hunger, humidity, and human hope were as decisive as any sword. The search for El Dorado did not begin as a quest for a city of gold, but as a systemic response to the crushing economic and psychological pressures of the 16th century Spanish Empire. On the surface, the conquistadors were driven by a simple, individual greed, but the deeper issue was the debt power cycle that fueled every expedition. Each venture into the unknown was a private enterprise, funded by high-interest loans and the literal mortgaging of the explorers' futures. In simple terms, a man like Gonzalo Pizarro or Francisco de Orellana did not just want to find gold. He had to find it to keep his creditors from seizing his lands and his reputation. This was the logistical engine of the conquest, a relentless, forward-moving pressure created by the requirement to pay for the ships, the horses, and the armor that had already been used. What truly shaped the outcome of the early expeditions was the language of the myth. At a superficial level, the Spanish heard stories of a gilded one, a chieftain of the Muisca people who covered himself in gold dust and submerged himself in Lake Guatavita. However, at the core of the conflict was a profound, cross-cultural misunderstanding. The indigenous people often used these stories as a strategic logistical tool to move the aggressive Spaniards away from their own territories. Gold is further inland, they would say, behind the next mountain, across the next river. Gradually, the Spanish converted these localized religious rituals into a permanent, physical destination. The deeper issue was that the Spanish could not conceive of wealth as a spiritual offering. To them, it was a biological necessity for the survival of their social status. The real tension of the first departures lay in the atmosphere of the camp. As the morning mist clung to the damp walls of Quito or Bogotá, the sound of the expedition was the heavy, industrial clatter of iron being forged and leather being stitched. Beneath all of this was the biological payload. An expedition for El Dorado was not just a group of men, it was a mobile ecosystem. They brought thousands of pigs as a walking larder, hundreds of war dogs, and a massive train of indigenous porters. The real tension lay in the weight of the expectations. You can imagine the creak of the leather saddles and the sharp, metallic jingle of the spurs in the quiet hour before the march. These were the sounds of a society that had bet everything on a dream, moving into a landscape that did not recognize their currency or their titles. Slowly, the expedition would leave the high, cool air of the Andes and begin the descent into the green wall of the Amazon basin. In simple terms, the logistics of the mountains were replaced by the logistics of the jungle. The real tension was the caloric deficit. A pig that can walk across a plateau cannot easily navigate a swamp. As the months passed, the walking larder began to shrink, not from consumption, but from exhaustion and disease. The deeper issue was the transition from a market economy to a survival economy. In the background, the conquistadors were forced to discard their heavy silk doublets and their ornate armor, their status symbols melting away in the relentless humidity. What quietly determined the outcome of these early weeks was the soldier's ability to adapt his stomach to the strange, bitter roots and the lean, tough meat of the rainforest. At a superficial level, the Spanish believed their iron, and their faith made them invincible. But beneath all of this was the logistics of the unknown. They were moving into a world where the sun was hidden by the canopy and the stars were obscured by the rain. The real tension was the loss of orientation. In the background, the compasses were often rendered useless by local magnetic anomalies or simply by the sheer lack of landmarks. This was a form of intellectual relaxation, not the pleasant kind, but the dangerous surrender of the mind to a landscape that offered no cognitive anchors. The quiet corridors of the forest were a labyrinth of water and vine, where the logic of the Spanish mapmaker was replaced by the logic of the indigenous guide. What truly shaped the outcome of the quest was the persistence of the mirage. In simple terms, the more the Spanish suffered, the more they believed the reward must be great. The deeper issue was a sunken cost fallacy. Having lost half their men and most of their horses to the fever and the mud, they could not turn back without admitting total failure. This created a systemic momentum that pushed them deeper into the interior. The real tension lay in the sensory hallucination. Every golden sunset reflected in a muddy river, every yellow-plumed bird, and every glittering piece of mica in the sand was interpreted as a sign of the city. The Spanish were hyper-scanning their environment, their desperate need for gold turning the natural world into a series of false promises. As events unfolded, the expedition of Gonzalo Pizarro in 1541 became the archetype of this logistical tragedy. He set out with 340 Spaniards and 4,000 indigenous allies. At a superficial level, it was a small army. At a systemic level, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The real tension lay in the dietary collapse. Within months, they were reduced to eating their dogs and the leather of their saddles. Beneath all of this was the social fracture. When Orellana was sent ahead in a small boat to find food and never returned, the expedition split into two different logistical trajectories, one group struggling back toward the Andes and the other accidentally discovering the length of the Amazon River. The quiet corridors of the river became the site of a profound discovery born from a profound mistake. The deeper issue of the El Dorado myth was its role as a vaporware economy. In simple terms, the idea of the city was more valuable to the expansion of the empire than the city itself would have been. The real tension lay in the granting of commissions. The Spanish crown could keep thousands of restless, dangerous men busy by granting them the right to conquer and settle lands that might not even exist. It was a way to export the internal violence of the conquistadors into the external wilderness. In the background, as the soldiers sharpened their swords by the campfire, they were participating in a massive, systemic distraction that allowed the colonial administration in the cities to stabilize. Gradually, the discovery turned into a dislocation. On the surface, the Spanish were the explorers, but the real tension lay in the fact that they were being absorbed by the jungle. They began to adopt indigenous survival techniques, the use of the dugout canoe, the eating of manioc, and the wearing of lighter cotton clothing. This was a reverse logistics. Instead of the empire imposing itself on the wilderness was dismantling the empire's representatives. The sound of the morning was no longer the jingle of the spurs, but the rhythmic dip of the paddle and the calls of the macors. The deeper issue was that the more American the Spaniards became, the closer they felt to the truth of the myth, even as they lost the ability to explain it to the world they had left behind. In simple terms, the search for El Dorado was the biological cost of a dream. The real tension of the morning, the struggle to light a fire in the rain, was met by a spirit that refused to see the reality of the landscape. They were looking for a city of gold in a world made of green, and the clash between those two colors defined the birth of South American history. As the sun sets over the canopy, the shadow of the conquistador stretches long across the mud, a final, weary reach for a wealth that was always just around the next bend. The transition from the dream to the reality is beginning, and the quiet corridors of the Amazon are waiting to swallow the truth. As the main body of Gonzalo Pizarro's expedition stalled in the land of cinnamon, the real tension lay in the immediate threat of starvation. On the surface, Francisco de Orellana's departure with 57 men in a small, hastily constructed boat was a mission of rescue, but beneath all of this was a profound logistical gamble. In simple terms, they were separating from their primary supply line, the pigs and the porters, to follow the current of the Coca River. The deeper issue was that Orellana was moving from the static logistics of a camp to the kinetic logistics of a river descent. He was betting that the water would lead to food faster than the jungle could consume his men. What quietly determined the outcome of this split was the realization, after only a few days, that the current was too strong to return against. The quiet corridors of the river had become a one-way street. At a superficial level, Orellana's men were soldiers, but the real tension lay in their forced transition into shipwrights. When they reached a point where the food did not materialize and the river widened, they faced a systemic crisis. They had a boat that was too small and a crew that was too large. At the core of the conflict was the requirement for a vessel capable of navigating unknown rapids and potentially reaching the sea. Gradually, in a place they called Aperia, they began the impossible task of building a second brigantine from scratch. In the background, the sound of the camp was the rhythmic thud of the adze and the rasp of the saw. These men who had come to find gold were now scouring the forest for the hard logistics of timber, vines for rope, and resin for caulking. What truly shaped the outcome of this construction was the scavenger logistics of the Spanish. In simple terms, they had no forge, no nails, and no oakum. The real tension lay in their innovation. They used the iron from their own crossbows and the shoes of their dead horses to forge thousands of makeshift nails. They used the fibrous bark of local trees and the thick, sticky sap of the jungle to seal the hulls. Beneath all of this was a material transformation. The technology of the old world was being melted down and recast into the tools of the new world. As the morning mist rose from the river, the smell of the camp was a pungent mix of wood smoke and boiling resin, the scent of a desperate industry. The quiet corridors of the riverbank had been turned into a shipyard of necessity. Slowly, the dietary logistics of the river began to influence the crew's behavior. In simple terms, they were no longer looking for El Dorado. They were looking for a village with a granary. The real tension was the ambush of hunger. As events unfolded, Orellana discovered that the river was not an empty wilderness, but a densely populated corridor of complex chiefdoms. From a distance, it might appear that the Spanish were the aggressors, but the deeper issue was that they were nutritional beggars. Every encounter with the indigenous people was a logistical negotiation for maize and turtle meat. What quietly determined the outcome of these meetings was Orellana's ability to use his linguistic skills and a few glass beads to avoid a total military collapse. The quiet corridors of the river were the site of a tense, floating diplomacy. At this stage, the logistics of the walking larder had been replaced by the logistics of the turtle. In simple terms, the Amazon was a vast, aquatic protein source, but only for those who knew how to harvest it. The real tension lay in the Spanish inability to fish effectively in the deep, silt-laden waters. Beneath all of this was their reliance on captured caches of dried fish and turtle eggs found in the riverside villages. The deeper issue was the caloric instability. They would feast for a day on a captured store of manioc and then starve for a week as they drifted through uninhabited stretches. You can imagine the sound of the river, the low, constant gurgle of the brown water against the hull, and the silence of the men as they scanned the green wall for any sign of smoke or a clearing. What truly shaped the outcome of the descent was the psychology of the current. On the surface, the river was their vehicle, but the real tension lay in the loss of agency. In simple terms, the Spanish were no longer in control of their destination. They were being digested by the river system, moved along at its pace, not theirs. The deeper issue was the informational void. They had no idea if the river flowed for 100 miles or 1,000. In the background, the friar of the expedition, Gaspar de Carvajal, began to keep a chronicle of the journey. His writing was a form of cognitive logistics, an attempt to impose a narrative order on an experience that felt increasingly chaotic and surreal. The quiet corridors of the river were being mapped not with surveying tools, but with the ink of a desperate priest. Beneath all of this was the logistics of the Amazonians. As the months passed, the Spanish encountered larger and more organized societies. At a superficial level, these were tribes, but the real tension lay in the sheer scale of their agricultural production. Carvajal described miles of continuous settlements and vast stores of food. At the core of the conflict was the Spanish realization that the wealth of the jungle was not gold, but surplus. These societies had mastered the logistics of the river, the seasonal flood cycles, the raised bed farming, and the massive-scale turtle ranching. From a distance, the Spanish were seeing a green empire that their own European logic could not fully categorize. They were still looking for the Gilded One, while paddling past civilizations that had solved the problem of tropical survival on a massive scale. In simple terms, the quiet corridors of the river became the site of a sensory overload. The real tension was the scale of the environment. As events unfolded, the river widened until they could no longer see the opposite bank. To the Spanish, who were used to the intimate geographies of Europe, this was a logistical vertigo. Beneath all of this was the physical toll of the journey. The humidity rotted their clothes, the insects clouded their vision, and the constant damp warped the wood of their crossbows. What truly shaped the outcome of their survival was the minimalist logistics they adopted. They discarded everything that was not essential for floating or fighting. The high-status conquistador had been reduced to a sun-blackened, hungry rower, his identity stripped away by the relentless movement of the water. Gradually, the discovery of the Amazon became a race against the exhaustion of the hull. At this stage, the makeshift nails were rusting and the resin was cracking. In simple terms, the boats were dying. The real tension lay in the logistics of the sea. As the water turned brackish and the tides began to pull at the brigantines, the Spanish realized they were nearing the Atlantic. The deeper issue was that their river boats were not designed for the ocean. Beneath all of this was a final, frantic effort to strengthen the vessels using whatever materials remained. The sound of the morning was now the roar of the surf, a new and terrifying logistical challenge that required a different kind of courage. On the surface, Orellana's voyage was a failure because he found no gold. But beneath all of this was the greatest geographical discovery of the century. The real tension of the morning, the struggle to find a single meal, was the price paid for mapping the greatest river system on Earth. As the sun sets over the delta, the two small, battered brigantines look like toys against the vastness of the Atlantic. The logistics of the river are over, and the logistics of the open sea are beginning. The quiet corridors of the Amazon have been conquered, not by the sword, but by the relentless, drifting persistence of men who had no other choice. While Francisco de Orellana was being swept toward the Atlantic by the relentless current of the Amazon, the real tension lay behind him, in the high, thin air of the Andes. Gonzalo Pizarro, the man who had funded the expedition with the wealth of a conquered empire, found himself standing in the quiet corridors of a dying camp. In simple terms, the split of the expedition was not just a separation of men, but a total fracture of the logistical spine. Pizarro was left with the sick, the exhausted, and a dwindling supply of the walking larder that had once seemed inexhaustible. At a superficial level, he was still the governor of Quito and the brother of the man who had toppled the Inca, but the deeper issue was that his status meant nothing to the mud and the rot of the cloud forest. What truly shaped the outcome of the next 6 months was Pizarro's transition from a conqueror to a ghost, a leader of a skeletal remnant trying to reverse the logic of a one-way journey. The real tension of the retreat lay in the logistics of elevation. To return to Quito, the survivors had to climb back up the eastern slopes of the Andes, a vertical wall of saturated earth and jagged rock. Beneath all of this was the caloric debt they had accumulated. In the background, the horses, the primary logistical asset of the Spanish military, had become a liability. They could not climb the steep, rain-slicked trails, and their weight made them sink into the deep mires of the valley floors. Gradually, the decision was made to slaughter the remaining animals. This was a moment of profound systemic surrender. In simple terms, by eating their horses, the Spanish were consuming their own mobility and their tactical superiority. The sound of the morning was no longer the proud neighing of stallions, but the wet, heavy thud of the butcher's blade. The quiet corridors of the ascent were marked by the discarded remains of the very animals that had carried them into the heart of the myth. Slowly, the psychology of the rearguard began to dominate the group. At a superficial level, they were moving toward safety, but the deeper issue was the informational blackout. Pizarro had no way of knowing if Orellana had found food or if he had simply vanished into the green. This lack of certainty acted as a biological parasite, draining the morale of the men faster than the physical labor. The real tension was the social deconstruction. In the background, the hierarchy of the Spanish military began to dissolve under the pressure of absolute hunger. A nobleman and a common foot soldier were now equal in their desperation for a single piece of boiled leather or a handful of wild roots. What quietly determined the outcome of this social collapse was Pizarro's own physical endurance. He had to be the first ghost, the one who marched at the front, showing that the habit of the mind could still command a body that was essentially failing. What truly shaped the outcome of the retreat was the logistics of the indigenous portfolio. In simple terms, the Spanish were entirely dependent on the knowledge and the labor of the few remaining Andean porters they had brought with them. The real tension lay in the climatic shock. These porters, accustomed to the dry, cold air of the highlands, were dying in the humid heat of the lowlands. The deeper issue was that the Spanish extraction model, taking what they needed by force, was no longer working. In the background, the local tribes had vanished into the deeper forest, taking their stores of maize with them. This was a logistical embargo. The Spanish were left in a vacuum of resources, forced to eat the products of the wood, strange fungi, bitter stalks, and even the sea pigs, capybaras, they occasionally managed to trap. Beneath all of this was the logistics of the equipment. At this stage, the iron that had once been their pride had become their enemy. In simple terms, the humidity of the rainforest was reclaiming the metal. The real tension lay in the rusting of the empire. The swords were pitted, the breastplates were orange with corrosion, and the arquebuses, the primitive firearms, were useless because the gunpowder was perpetually damp. From a distance, they looked like a parade of scrap metal. The deeper issue was the energy cost of armor. A man who is starving cannot afford to carry 30 pounds of iron. Slowly, the trails behind the retreating column were littered with the logistical debris of the conquest: helmets, greaves, and broken pikes. This was the physical evidence of a system being dismantled by the environment. The quiet corridors of the mountains were becoming a graveyard for Spanish technology. Gradually, the sensory world of the retreat became one of gray light and constant rain. In simple terms, the weather was a logistical wall. The real tension was the hypothermia of the lowlands. While it was hot, the men were constantly wet, leading to a slow draining of core body heat and a weakening of the immune system. Beneath all of this was the medical collapse. The few supplies of oil and wine they had kept for medicinal purposes were long gone. The real tension was the silent toll of the jungle, the foot rot, the fevers, and the infections from even the smallest scratch. What truly shaped the outcome of their survival was the knowledge of the native auxiliaries. The few porters who remained showed the Spaniards how to use certain barks to treat the fever, a form of reverse medical logistics where the conquerors were saved by the science of the conquered. At a superficial level, the return to Quito was a military maneuver, but at the core of the conflict was the spirit of the remnant. In simple terms, these men were walking relics. By now, their clothes had rotted away entirely, and they were dressed in the skins of animals or the fibrous bark of trees. This was the final stage of imperial stripping. The deeper issue was the logistical humiliation. When they finally reached the outskirts of Quito in June 1542, after more than a year in the wild, the city did not recognize them. They were a column of 80 men, out of the hundreds who had left, who looked more like the barbarians they had come to rule than the Spanish lords they had once been. The real tension was the visual shock. The citizens of Quito, hearing of their approach, sent clothes and horses to meet them, but Pizarro and his men refused to put them on until they reached the city gates. They wanted the world to see the physical cost of the myth. What truly shaped the outcome of Pizarro's return was the logistical bankruptcy of the venture. In simple terms, the expedition had produced a negative return on investment. Pizarro had spent over 50,000 gold pesos, a fortune, and returned with nothing but the stories of those who had died. The real tension lay in the political vacuum. While he was gone, the political landscape of Peru had shifted. His brother, Francisco, had been assassinated, and a new civil war was brewing. The deeper issue was that the El Dorado expedition had acted as a systemic drain, removing the most capable men and the most vital resources from the colony at the exact moment they were needed most. The quiet corridors of the palace in Quito were now a place of mourning and debt, rather than the triumph he had imagined. Beneath all of this was the logistical legacy of the cinnamon. In simple terms, the original purpose of the trip, to find the land of cinnamon, had been a failure because the cinnamon they found was of poor quality and impossible to harvest profitably. The real tension lay in the economic miscalculation. The Spanish had tried to apply a European mercantile model to a tropical ecosystem that they did not understand. The deeper issue was that they had ignored the true wealth of the region, the biodiversity and the indigenous knowledge, in favor of a singular commodity. This was the constraint of the monoculture. Because they were only looking for one thing, gold or cinnamon, they were blind to everything else. The quiet corridors of the forest were full of resources that could have fed them, but their imperial vision made them invisible. Slowly, the logistical aftershocks of the return began to spread through the colonial administration. In simple terms, the failure of the Pizarro expedition acted as a warning system for the Spanish crown. It showed that the age of the great conquistador was coming to an end. The real tension was the regulatory shift. The crown began to replace the private entrepreneurs like Pizarro with professional bureaucrats, the oidores and corregidors. This was a move from exploitative logistics to administrative logistics. The deeper issue was that the empire needed stability and taxes, not more wild goose chases after golden kings. The quiet corridors of the Council of the Indies in Spain were now filled with reports on the inestimable waste of the Amazonian venture. On the surface, Pizarro's return was the end of the story. But beneath all of this was the ghostly persistence of the myth. The men who survived did not blame the myth. They blamed the river, the rain, or the traitor Orellana. The real tension of the morning, the memory of the friends they had left in the mud, was met by a renewed determination to try again. In simple terms, the systemic fever was not cured, it was merely suppressed. The survivors told stories that grew in the telling, adding layers of gold and majesty to the gilded one to justify their own suffering. The deeper issue was that the logistical disaster of 1541 to 1542 became the marketing brochure for the next 50 years of exploration. The quiet corridors of the Spanish imagination were now permanently haunted by the image of a city they had failed to find. In simple terms, the return of Gonzalo Pizarro was the final audit of a specific kind of Spanish ambition. The real tension lay in the realization that the world was larger and more resistant than their iron and their horses could manage. The deeper issue was the ecological friction. The Andes and the Amazon had acted as a systemic filter, stripping away the layers of European civilization until only the ghost remained. As the sun sets over the steeples of Quito, the survivors sit in the quiet corridors of the church, their bodies broken but their minds still wandering in the green. The logistics of the retreat are over, but the debt of the dream will never be paid. On the surface, the focus of the El Dorado quest shifted from the vast, horizontal expanses of the Amazon basin to a singular, vertical point in the high Andes, Lake Guatavita. It might appear that this transition from a forest-wide hunt to a localized engineering project would simplify the logistics of the search, but at the core of the conflict was a new and formidable adversary, the physics of water and the weight of the earth. The real tension lay in the fact that the Spanish had finally found the specific site of the Muisca ritual that had birthed the legend. They were no longer chasing a moving rumor. They were staring at a perfectly circular, emerald green lake nestled in a volcanic crater. The deeper issue, however, was that the gold they sought was not in a treasury or a palace, but at the bottom of a deep, cold, and seemingly bottomless pool. What truly shaped the outcome of the next 3 centuries of effort was the Spanish refusal to accept the logistical impossibility of draining a mountain. In simple terms, the logistics of the lake began with Hernán Pérez de Quesada in 1545. By now, the Spanish had established a systemic presence in the new kingdom of Granada, and the era of the drifting expedition was giving way to the era of the organized work camp. The deeper issue was the extraction model. Quesada realized that to reach the gold, he had to move the water. Beneath all of this was the bucket chain, a primitive but relentless logistical solution. For 3 months, during the height of the dry season, hundreds of indigenous laborers were forced to form a human line from the water's edge to the rim of the crater. The real tension lay in the rhythm of the slosh. You can imagine the sound of the morning, the rhythmic splashing of gourd bowls, the heavy breathing of men on the steep slopes, and the constant, wet drip of the water returning to the soil. At a superficial level, this was a simple task, but the real tension was the evaporation refill cycle. For every 1,000 gallons removed by hand, the mountain springs and the afternoon rains returned nearly as much. As the months passed, Quesada's logistical persistence yielded a minor victory. He managed to lower the water level by about 3 meters. From a distance, this seemed like progress, but the real tension lay in the mud problem. As the water receded, it revealed not a golden floor, but a deep, treacherous layer of silt and slime. Beneath all of this was the systemic disappointment. They found a few hundred pieces of gold jewelry and some emeralds, enough to prove the myth was real, but not enough to pay for the logistical cost of the labor. What quietly determined the outcome of this first attempt was the realization that the lake was shaped like a funnel. The deeper they went, the more water they had to move, and the more the crater walls threatened to collapse. The quiet corridors of the high Andes were no longer a site of spiritual offering, but a construction site of failed engineering. Gradually, the logistics of the lake attracted more sophisticated ambition. In 1580, a wealthy merchant from Bogotá named Antonio de Sepulveda undertook a project that moved from bucket logistics to hydraulic engineering. On the surface, Sepulveda was a businessman, but the real tension lay in his technological hubris. He obtained a formal contract from the Spanish crown, promising a share of the profits in exchange for the right to cut a massive notch in the rim of the crater. The deeper issue was the volume of displacement. To drain the lake effectively, he had to move thousands of tons of rock and earth by hand. At this stage, the sound of the morning was the sharp, metallic ring of the iron pickaxe against the volcanic stone, and the roar of the artificial waterfall as the water finally began to spill through the new channel. The real tension of Sepulveda's project lay in the structural integrity of the crater. As events unfolded, the notch successfully lowered the water by nearly 20 meters. Beneath all of this was the logistical revelation. The receding water exposed a treasure trove of Muisca gold, crowns, breastplates, and intricate figurines. However, at the core of the conflict was the cost of success. The water, rushing through the narrow cut, began to erode the very walls of the notch. Slowly, the logistics of extraction were overtaken by the logistics of disaster. A massive mudslide, triggered by the pressure of the water and the instability of the carved stone, buried the primary dig site and many of the workers. In simple terms, the mountain had defended its treasure. Sepulveda was left with enough gold to be famous, but not enough to remain wealthy after paying his debts. The deeper issue was the systemic warning. The deeper you went into the lake, the more the earth itself conspired against the machine. What quietly determined the outcome for the next 200 years was the institutional memory of these failures. From a distance, it might appear that the Spanish gave up, but the real tension was the resource reallocation. The Crown, realizing that draining the lake was a logistical black hole, focused its energy on the silver mines of Potosi. However, the lake remained a golden mirage in the background of the colonial mind. As the years passed, the quiet corridors of the crater were reclaimed by the mist and the paramo grass, but the dream of El Dorado was now stationary. It was no longer a city to be found, but a floor to be reached. The logistics had shifted from discovery to excavation, a change that reflected the transition of the Spanish Empire from a force of exploration to a force of bureaucracy and mining. By now, the story of the lake had become a logistical fable. In simple terms, every few decades, a new entrepreneur would arrive with a new system to solve the water problem. It may seem that these men were fools, but the deeper issue was the persistence of the proof. Because a small amount of gold was always found near the edges, it provided the data point that justified further investment. The real tension lay in the calculation of the deep. Mathematicians in the 18th century began to estimate the total value of the gold at the bottom, creating a theoretical fortune that ran into the billions. This was a form of intellectual relaxation, using numbers to ignore the physical constraints of the mountain. The quiet corridors of the scientific academies in Europe were now debating the best way to drain a lake that most of the members had never seen. At a superficial level, the final major logistical attempt occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, involving British capital and modern machinery. As the months passed, the contractors of the dream used steam pumps and tunnels. Beneath all of this was the final conflict with the mud. The real tension was that as soon as the water was pumped out, the lake bed turned into a liquid solid, a thick, prehistoric ooze that was impossible to walk on, and that hardened like concrete under the sun. In simple terms, the water was the only thing keeping the mud soft enough to move. By removing the water, the engineers had accidentally locked the vault. This was the ultimate logistical irony. The solution to the water problem had created a new, insurmountable mud problem. What truly shaped the outcome of the El Dorado story was the realization that the value of the lake was not in its contents, but in its untouchability. The deeper issue was that Lake Guatavita functioned as a systemic mirror. It reflected the specific greed and the specific technology of every era that tried to conquer it. The Spanish tried buckets, the merchants tried notches, and the British tried steam. In the background, the lake remained, a silent and serene emerald in the mountains. The real tension of the morning, the struggle to drain the green water, was always met by the silent, rhythmic refill of the springs. The quiet corridors of the Andes had proven that some logistical problems are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be a permanent part of the landscape. Slowly, the logistics of the lake shifted for the final time, from extraction to conservation. In simple terms, the Colombian government eventually banned all attempts to drain or mine the lake, declaring it a national heritage site. The real tension lay in the end of the dream. By closing the vault, the state had finally acknowledged that the myth was more valuable than the gold. The deeper issue was the archiving of the mirage. The lake was returned to the quiet corridors of the spirit, a place where the Muisca rituals were once again the only logistics that mattered. As the sun sets over the crater today, the water is still, and the notch carved by Sepulveda is a grassy scar, a physical reminder of the 3-century battle between the human will and the mountain's depth. In simple terms, the story of Lake Guatavita is the final audit of the El Dorado legend. It proves that the search was always a struggle with the environment. The real tension of the battle was never with a golden king, but with the logistical friction of water, mud, and rock. As the mist settles over the emerald surface, the listener can feel the peace of a location that has finally been left alone. The buckets are gone, the pumps are rusted, and the silence is total. The transition is complete. The lake is no longer a mine, it is a memory. On the surface, the failure of the Spanish to find a physical hoard of gold at Lake Guatavita should have acted as a systemic deterrent, signaling the end of the quest. However, beneath all of this was the necessity of hope. The deeper issue was that the Spanish Empire, and soon its European rivals, had become chronologically and economically invested in the existence of a golden civilization. If it did not reside in the Andes, the logistical logic of the age dictated that it must exist in the last remaining blank space on the map, the vast, unexplored interior between the Orinoco and the Amazon rivers, known today as the Guiana Highlands. This shift marked a transition from the search for a gilded man to the search for a gilded city, the legendary Manoa. What truly shaped the outcome of this phase was the creation of a paper empire, where the ink of the cartographer became more influential than the reality of the geography. The real tension lay in the birth of Lake Paraíba. From a distance, the reports of indigenous tribes described a massive inland sea in the heart of the Guianas, on whose shores the city of Manoa was said to stand. At the core of the conflict between European expectation and South American reality was a profound misunderstanding of the seasonal flood cycles. What quietly determined the outcome of these reports was the Rupununi savanna, a region that, during the heavy tropical rains, transforms into a shallow, horizon-spanning lake. To a weary explorer standing on a distant ridge, this seasonal inundation looked like a permanent sea. By now, this visual error had been codified into the informational logistics of Europe. Once a geographer placed Lake Paraíba on a map, every subsequent mapmaker copied it, creating a systemic phantom that would haunt the world's atlases for nearly 300 years. In simple terms, the entry of the English into the search for El Dorado turned the quest into a geopolitical logistics race. As the months passed in the late 16th century, Sir Walter Raleigh became the primary architect of this English ambition. Raleigh was not merely a dreamer, he was a master of statecraft logistics. He understood that, to challenge the Spanish hegemony in the New World, England needed a base of operations and a source of wealth that could rival the silver of Potosi. The real tension lay in his reliance on captured Spanish documents. He had seized the papers of the explorer Antonio de Berrio, who had spent decades wandering the Orinoco. Beneath all of this was the translation of the myth. Raleigh took the Spanish failure and reframed it as an English opportunity, convincing Queen Elizabeth I that the Empire of Guiana was waiting to become a protectorate of the English crown. At this stage, the logistics of the expedition moved from the high Andes to the labyrinthine water world of the Orinoco Delta. From a distance, the delta appears as a solid wall of green, but beneath all of this is a chaotic network of thousands of tidal channels. The real tension was the draft of the ships. Raleigh's heavy ocean-going galleons could not navigate the shallow, silt-laden waters of the delta. In simple terms, he was forced to leave his mobile fortress at the coast and transition to small boat logistics. His men crowded into longboats and barges, stripping away the comforts of the ship to face the river. The sound of the morning was no longer the creak of the great masts, but the rhythmic, hypnotic dip of the wooden oars and the constant, heavy breathing of men rowing against a 4-knot current in 90% humidity. Slowly, the nutritional reality of the English sailors began to collapse. At a superficial level, they had brought the standard naval rations of the era: salted beef, hard biscuit, and beer. But the deeper issue was that the tropical heat turned the beer sour and the beef into a putrid liability within weeks. Beneath all of this was the caloric crisis. The English were forced to adopt the logistics of the Warao, the indigenous people of the water who lived in houses built on stilts within the delta. At the core of the conflict was the English stomach's struggle with river bread. The Warao showed them how to extract starch from the pith of the Morich palm, creating a dense, fibrous cake. The real tension lay in the sensory shock. To a sailor from Devon, eating palm pith and roasted iguanas was a sign of logistical degeneration, yet it was the only thing keeping them from the quiet corridors of the grave. What truly shaped the outcome of Raleigh's 1595 expedition was the logistics of the senses. As they rode deeper into the interior, the environment became a biological wall. The real tension was the acoustic overload. In the background, the jungle was never silent. The scream of the howler monkeys, the constant hum of billions of insects, and the sudden, terrifying crash of a falling limb created a state of logistical fatigue. The men could not sleep, and their minds began to fray. Gradually, the silver-gray mist that rose from the river every morning became a canvas for their hallucinations. They began to see the reflections of gold in the mica-flecked sands of the riverbanks. To a man suffering from heat exhaustion and malnutrition, a glittering rock was not a geological fact. It was a systemic promise that the city of Manoa was just around the next bend. Beneath all of this was the logistics of mapping. Raleigh was a man of the Renaissance, and he believed that by naming and measuring the land, he could own it. At a superficial level, he was recording the river's course, but the deeper issue was the imposition of the grid. He gave English names to the tributaries and the mountains, attempting to convert the wilderness into a property. The real tension lay in the ink and the damp. His journals and maps were perpetually soggy, the ink blurring on the page. This was the material resistance of the Guyanas. The environment refused to be captured by the pen. What quietly determined the outcome of his report, the discovery of Guyana, was his decision to focus on the theoretical wealth of the region rather than the practical hardship of the journey. He wrote of mountains of gold to ensure that the investment logistics in London would remain favorable for a second trip. By now, the paper empire had become a self-sustaining reality. In simple terms, because Raleigh's book became a bestseller in Europe, the city of Manoa was found in the minds of the public, if not on the ground. The real tension was the validation of the era. Mapmakers in Amsterdam and London used Raleigh's descriptions to create even more detailed maps of Lake Parime. They added surrounding mountains, neighboring cities, and complex trade routes. At this stage, the logistics of the myth were no longer dependent on the South American landscape. They were dependent on the European library. The deeper issue was that the quiet corridors of the royal courts were now making policy based on a landscape that existed only in ink. This was the ultimate informational decoupling, where the system of knowledge had completely separated from the system of reality. The real tension of the Orinoco ascent lay in the logistics of the tribes. Raleigh realized that he could not find the city without the help of the Arhuacas and the Orjones. Beneath all of this was the diplomatic theater. He presented the tribes with a portrait of Queen Elizabeth, claiming she was the great cacique of the north who would protect them from the Spanish. From a distance, this looked like an alliance, but at the core of the conflict was a mutual exploitation. The tribes used Raleigh's soldiers to fight their local rivals, while Raleigh used the tribes' stories to fuel his quest. What quietly determined the outcome of these encounters was the logistics of the gift. Raleigh traded metal knives and axes, tools that transformed the tribe's ability to clear the forest for information that was often strategically vague or intentionally misleading. As events unfolded, the expedition reached the confluence of the Caroni River. On the surface, the sight of the massive waterfalls, the cataracts of the Orinoco, was a moment of awe. But the deeper issue was the logistical barrier. The water was too powerful for the longboats to move any further inland. The real tension was the constraint of the season. The rains were beginning, and the river was rising at a rate of a foot a day. In simple terms, the window of opportunity was closing. If they did not turn back now, they would be trapped in the interior with no way to navigate the flooded delta. Raleigh, ever the pragmatist, chose to retreat, but he did so while taking samples of the earth, shiny pyrites and quartz that he claimed were mother of gold. This was the final logistical deception of the voyage, a way to turn a physical retreat into a promotional success. The deeper issue of Raleigh's journey was the legacy of the lie. As the months passed and he returned to England, his failure to bring back actual gold led to his eventual downfall and imprisonment in the Tower of London. However, what truly shaped the outcome of the next century was the survival of the map. Even as Raleigh sat in his cell, the maps he helped create were being used by Dutch and French explorers to launch their own logistical nightmares into the Guianas. The city of Manoa had become a permanent goal, a systemic requirement for any nation that wanted to be a player in the Atlantic world. The quiet corridors of the tower were filled with Raleigh's writings, where he continued to refine the logistics of the impossible, convinced that he had merely missed the city by a few miles. In simple terms, the search for Manoa was the logistics of the mirage, the real tension of the morning. The struggle to row against the brown flood was met by a mind that saw a golden city in the spray of every waterfall. The deeper issue was the cultural friction. The English were looking for a state with a capital, but they were moving through a world of flow and season. They tried to pin the city down to a coordinate, but the city was a story that moved with the water. As the sun sets over the Orinoco today, the quiet corridors of the river are still there, the howler monkeys still scream, and the silver mist still rises. The transition from exploration to cartography is complete, and the city of Manoa remains exactly where it has always been, on the map and nowhere else. On the surface, the expedition led by Pedro de Ursua in 1560 was meant to be the final, state-sponsored resolution to the El Dorado question. However, at the core of the conflict was the systemic decay of the conquistador spirit. By the mid-16th century, the golden age of discovery had curdled into a logistics of madness. The men recruited for this mission were not the disciplined soldiers of the early conquest, but the desperados and the unemployed swords of Peru, men who had survived the civil wars and had no place in the new, bureaucratic colonial order. In simple terms, the expedition was a social pressure valve, a way for the Spanish authorities to export 300 of their most dangerous, restless citizens into the quiet corridors of the Amazon. The deeper issue was that, when you build an expedition out of desperation and debt, the primary logistical output is not gold, but treason. The real tension of the descent began at the shipyards of the Huallaga River. From a distance, the construction of the fleet appeared organized, but beneath all of this was the rot of the foundation. The wood used for the brigantines was green and improperly seasoned, a material failure that would haunt the voyage. As the months passed in the damp heat, the sound of the camp was the rhythmic, hollow thud of hammers on soft wood and the constant, low murmur of mutiny. What quietly determined the outcome of the expedition's start was the arrival of Lope de Aguirre, a man who functioned as a biological corrupter of the mission's logic. Aguirre did not believe in El Dorado, he believed in the logistics of vengeance. To him, the jungle was not a path to wealth, but a laboratory for a new kind of nihilistic power. In simple terms, the quiet corridors of the river became the site of a total institutional collapse. As the current pulled the fleet deeper into the interior, the dietary logistics once again became a weapon. Ursua, the commander, attempted to maintain the etiquette of the empire, insisting on silver service and soft beds even as the men were reduced to eating the bark of the trees. The real tension lay in this disconnect between rank and reality. Aguirre used the men's hunger as a systemic lever, whispering that Ursua was a soft leader who cared more for his mistress than for the lives of his soldiers. The deeper issue was the informational isolation. Once the expedition passed the last known outpost, the only truth was the truth that Aguirre spoke. The sound of the morning was no longer the prayer of the friars, but the sudden, sharp silence that followed the first assassination. Slowly, the logistics of the coup replaced the logistics of the search. At this stage, the expedition had physically moved into the heart of the Green Labyrinth. On the surface, they were still looking for the Gilded One, but at the core of the conflict was the rebellion against the crown. Aguirre orchestrated the murder of Ursua and declared himself the wrath of God. In a moment of supreme logistical defiance, he forced his men to sign a document formally denouncing their allegiance to King Philip Roman II of Spain. Beneath all of this was a psychological siege. Aguirre understood that, by making his men traitors, he had locked the exit. They could never return to the Spanish world, they could only move forward into the madness. The real tension lay in the ink of treason, the sound of 300 men signing their own death warrants as the river hurried them toward the unknown. What truly shaped the outcome of the Marignones, as Aguirre's men were called, was the logistics of the terror. In simple terms, Aguirre turned the fleet into a floating prison. The real tension was the sensory paranoia. In the background, every rustle of the leaves on the riverbank was interpreted as an indigenous ambush, and every whisper among the crew was interpreted as a counter-mutiny. The deeper issue was the simplification of the system. Aguirre realized that in the jungle, the only hard logistics that mattered were iron and fear. He executed anyone who showed a trace of intellectual relaxation or doubt. The quiet corridors of the river were now marked by the drifting bodies of his own men. This was a negative economy, where the value of a human life had dropped to zero, while the value of absolute loyalty had become the only currency. At a superficial level, the Marignones were still following the Amazon, but the deeper issue was the loss of the golden goal. Aguirre had realized what Pizarro and Orellana had not, that El Dorado was a systemic mirage used by the crown to waste the lives of the poor. He redirected the logistics of the voyage toward a new, terrifying destination, the conquest of the Spanish Empire itself. He planned to exit the Amazon, sail north to Panama, cross the isthmus, and invade Peru from the sea. This was a logistical fantasy of the highest order, but beneath all of this was a terrifying clarity. Aguirre was the first post-conquest man, one who had realized that the real El Dorado was the power already held by the bureaucrats in Lima and Mexico City. The real tension was the scale of the ambition. He was trying to conquer a continent with 2 leaking boats and a handful of starving mutineers. Gradually, the nutritional collapse of the expedition reached its terminal phase. In simple terms, the walking larder was gone, and the river bread was insufficient. The real tension was the physiology of the madness. Chronic malnutrition and the lack of salt were affecting the men's cognitive functions, making Aguirre's paranoid visions seem like rational truths. Beneath all of this was the logistics of the environment. The Amazonian floods had scoured the riverside villages of their stores, leaving the Marignones in a biological vacuum. The deeper issue was the erosion of the self. As their clothes rotted and their bodies wasted, the soldiers became creatures of the current, their only remaining identity being their shared status as rebels. What quietly determined the outcome of their journey through the Delta was their transition from a military unit to a human plague, a force that consumed everything in its path and left only ash and bone. The real tension of the river's end lay in the transition to the ocean. As events unfolded, Aguirre's fleet reached the Atlantic. At a superficial level, this should have been a moment of relief, but at the core of the conflict was the hostility of the coast. The brigantines, built of green wood and held together by rusted nails and jungle resin, were nearly disintegrated. In simple terms, the material logistics were failing just as the strategic logistics were beginning. Aguirre forced his men to caulk the ships with their own clothing and the hair of their few remaining horses. The sound of the morning was the roar of the Atlantic surf, a sensory reminder that the quiet corridors of the forest were behind them and the public execution of the Spanish law was ahead. What truly shaped the outcome of Aguirre's final stand on the island of Margarita was the logistics of the letter. While he was occupying the island and murdering its officials, he wrote a famous letter to King Philip Roman II. In simple terms, the letter was a logistical audit of the conquest. He detailed the years of suffering, the lack of support from the crown, and the ingratitude of the empire. The real tension lay in the clarity of the accusation. He called the king a cruel and ungrateful lord. This was the intellectual conclusion of the search for El Dorado, the realization that the gold was a lie, the kings were tyrants, and the only truth was the quiet corridors of the jungle where men died for nothing. Beneath all of this was the systemic rupture, the first formal declaration of American independence, born not from liberty, but from a total logistical breakdown. In the background, the imperial machine was finally waking up to the threat. The real tension was the speed of the response. Spanish authorities in Venezuela and New Granada moved with a bureaucratic logistics that Aguirre could not match. They did not send heroes, they sent accountants, lawyers, and regular troops. The deeper issue was the isolation of the rebel. As soon as Aguirre's men saw the public majesty of the crown's banners, their logistics of fear began to crumble. One by one, they deserted, realizing that the madness of the jungle had no place in the order of the sea. The final sound of the expedition was not the clash of swords, but the single shot that Aguirre used to kill his own daughter to prevent her from being captured by the king's men. On the surface, the story of Lope de Aguirre is a footnote in the search for El Dorado. But at a systemic level, it was the terminal event. It proved that the quest for gold, when pushed to its logical extreme, led only to the destruction of the soul and the state. The real tension of the morning, the struggle to survive the green water, had led to a moral void. The quiet corridors of the Amazon had acted as a systemic solvent, dissolving the laws of God and man until only the wrath remained. As the sun sets over the Venezuelan coast, where Aguirre was finally executed and dismembered, the logistics of the madness are over. The deeper issue was that the empire had learned its lesson. It would no longer seek El Dorado with armies of desperados, but with the slow, patient logistics of the map. By the turn of the 19th century, the search for El Dorado underwent its final, most profound systemic transformation. On the surface, The era of the sword-bearing conquistador and the desperate mutineer had passed, replaced by the logistics of the lens. The deeper issue was that the Spanish Empire, now aging and heavily bureaucratic, had lost its appetite for golden mirages, yet it still lacked a definitive scientific audit of its own interior. At the core of the conflict was the informational persistence of Lake Paraim and the city of Manoa. Despite centuries of failure, these phantoms remained on the official charts, a cartographic ghost that the empire could not exercise without the precision of the Enlightenment. What truly shaped the outcome of this era was the arrival of Alexander von Humboldt, a man who functioned as a biological and mathematical scanner of the South American continent. The real tension of Humboldt's 1799 expedition lay in the transition from myth to measurement. In simple terms, Humboldt was not looking for a city made of gold, he was looking for the truth of the grid. He brought with him a suite of high-precision logistics, chronometers to measure longitude, sextants for latitude, barometers for altitude, and cyanometers to measure the exact shade of the blue sky. The deeper issue was that these tools were the ultimate anti-myth technology. A myth survives on the vague and the miraculous. A sextant demands the concrete and the absolute. As Humboldt moved into the quiet corridors of the Orinoco, the sound of the morning was no longer the prayer for gold, but the steady, rhythmic ticking of his clocks and the scratching of his pen as he recorded the temperature of the river water every hour. Slowly, the logistics of the Casaquaya became the focal point of the mission. For centuries, the quiet corridors of the upper Orinoco were rumored to be connected to the Amazon system by a mysterious, impassable natural canal. If this connection existed, it would be the systemic key to the entire continent's internal trade. At a superficial level, this was a geographical question, but at the core of the conflict was the cartographic credibility of the age. Most European geographers dismissed the connection as a logistical fantasy. Humboldt, however, committed his entire mission to proving its existence through empirical navigation. The real tension was the physical toll of the audit. For 75 days, Humboldt and his companion, Aimé Bonpland, lived in a dugout canoe, their bodies covered in the biological warfare of the jungle, mosquitoes, ants, and biting flies. Beneath all of this was the logistics of the specimen. They were not just moving, they were collecting, drying, and cataloging thousands of plants and minerals. In simple terms, the quiet corridors of the river became a laboratory in motion. The real tension lay in the metabolism of discovery. Humboldt realized that the indigenous knowledge he encountered was not primitive, but a highly evolved logistical adaptation to the environment. He studied how the tribes prepared curare poison and how they used the electricity of the eel. Beneath all of this was the dismantling of the El Dorado layer. Every time Humboldt recorded the exact coordinates of a village or the flow rate of a tributary, he was erasing a piece of the Manoa legend. He was draining the map of its mysteries, replacing the Golden City with the scientific fact. The deeper issue was the intellectual relaxation of Europe. The public wanted a gilded king, but Humboldt was giving them a systemic map of nature, a realization that the real wealth of the Amazon was its interconnected climate and its staggering biodiversity. What truly shaped the outcome of the search for Lake Paraim was Humboldt's logistics of the negative proof. From a distance, the Rupununi savanna still looked like a potential site for the great inland sea. However, Humboldt applied the logistics of the barometer. He measured the atmospheric pressure and the elevation of the surrounding terrain, proving that the geological structure of the region could not support a permanent lake of the size described on the maps. In a single, systemic strike, he deleted Lake Parim from the world's geography. The real tension was the psychological void this left behind. For 300 years, the city of Manoa had been the center of the unknown. By proving it did not exist, Humboldt was effectively closing the frontier. The quiet corridors of the Guianas were finally empty of European dreams, but full of European data. Gradually, the logistics of the lens moved toward the logistics of the narrative. After returning to Europe, Humboldt spent nearly 30 years and his entire personal fortune publishing his personal narrative of travels. In simple terms, he turned the disaster of the conquistadors into the triumph of the scientist. The real tension lay in the redefinition of value. He argued that the gold of the Americas was not the metal in the ground, but the information in the system. He described the isotherms and the unity of nature, creating a global logistics of the environment. The deeper issue was that he had replaced the Gilded One with the universal laws. This was the final audit of the myth, the realization that the empire had been looking for the wrong kind of treasure. The real El Dorado was the functional logic of the planet itself. Beneath all of this was the logistics of the indigenous archive. Humboldt was one of the first to treat indigenous languages and oral histories as systemic data. He realized that the Golden City was a lost translation, a metaphorical description of a localized peak of agricultural production or a specific seasonal ritual that the Spanish had hard-coded into a literal city. The real tension was the correction of the error. By reinterpreting the myth as a cultural signal rather than a physical destination, Humboldt provided the exit strategy for the European imagination. He allowed the world to let go of the mirage without feeling a sense of failure. The deeper issue was the repurposing of the search. The energy that once went into finding gold now went into the logistics of the plantation and the extraction of rubber and cinchona. At a superficial level, Humboldt's work was the end of El Dorado. But the real tension lay in the persistence of the human impulse. Even as Humboldt was measuring the Orinoco, the logistics of the fever was merely shifting its form. The deeper issue was that the search for wealth had become institutionalized. In the background, the newly independent South American republics began to use Humboldt's maps to launch the logistics of the commodity. They weren't looking for a king of gold, they were looking for the gold of the soil. The sound of the morning in the quiet corridors of the forest was now the sound of the surveyor's chain and the woodman's axe. The Gilded One had been replaced by the natural resource, a systemic shift that would lead to a new and even more devastating logistical extraction in the century to come. What quietly determined the outcome of Humboldt's legacy was the democratization of the unknown. In simple terms, by mapping the interior, he made it accessible to the world's capital. The real tension was the paradox of discovery. By saving the Amazon from the myth of El Dorado, he had exposed it to the logistics of global trade. The deeper issue was that the quiet corridors were no longer protected by their mystery. They were now a known asset on the balance sheet of the world. This was the final irony of the lens. The tool used to find the truth ended up facilitating the industrial consumption of the very landscape it sought to understand. Slowly, we reach the end of the Enlightenment's audit. We have seen how the logistics of the sextant replaced the logistics of the sword. We have observed the erasing of the lake and the birth of the environment. At a superficial level, Humboldt was the hero who brought light to the dark continent, but the real tension lay in the weight of the light. Every fact he recorded was a systemic constraint placed upon the wilderness. The deeper issue was that the quiet corridors of the Amazon were now part of the public archive of humanity. As the sun sets over the Andes today, the ghost of Humboldt still walks the trails, his barometer in hand, forever measuring the height of a mountain that no longer holds a secret king. The 19th century did not kill the dream of El Dorado. It merely shifted the systemic payload from the yellow of gold to the milky white of latex. On the surface, the rubber boom that ignited in the late 1800s was a modern industrial phenomenon driven by the global demand for tires and insulation. But at the core of the conflict was the same logistical fever that had consumed Pizarro and Orellana. The deeper issue was that the quiet corridors of the Amazon were found to contain a different kind of gilded king, the heavier Brasiliensis tree. In simple terms, the empire was no longer looking for a city built of gold. It was building a city built by rubber. What truly shaped the outcome of this era was the logistics of the extraction, a process that turned the entire river system into a vast, open-air factory. The real tension of the rubber boom lay in the labor-to-distance ratio. Unlike the conquistadors who sought a single horde, the rubber barons needed a systemic network of millions of individual trees, each scattered miles apart in the dense jungle. To manage this, they developed the aviamento system, a form of debt-based logistics that mirrored the financial pressures of the early conquest. In the background, a tapper, seringueiro, would be advanced tools and food at inflated prices, ensuring he was perpetually in debt to the rubber lord. The real tension was the daily grind. The sound of the morning was no longer the prayer of the friar, but the rhythmic, slicing sound of the facao machete cutting a V-shaped groove into the bark. This was the biological harvest, where the wealth of the forest was literally bled into small tin cups. Slowly, the logistics of the river reached a level of technological intensity that the early explorers could not have imagined. In simple terms, the dugout canoe was replaced by the steamship logistics of companies like the Amazon Steam Navigation Company. From a distance, the sight of a paddle wheeler churning through the brown water of the Rio Negro looked like the arrival of civilization. However, at the core of the conflict was the extraction efficiency. These ships carried the white gold downstream to the Atlantic while bringing the luxury logistics of Europe upstream. This was a reverse colonization of the senses. The rubber barons did not want to adapt to the jungle. They wanted to import the continent. The real tension was the scent of the port, the smell of raw, smoking rubber balls mixing with the expensive French perfumes and fine Havana cigars of the elite. What truly shaped the outcome of this wealth was the construction of the Teatro Amazonas in Manaus. At a superficial level, this grand opera house, built in 1896, was a testament to the success of the boom. But beneath all of this was the logistical absurdity of its creation. The bricks were brought from Italy, the roofing tiles from France, and the crystal chandeliers from Bohemia. The deeper issue was the atmospheric friction. They were building a European monument in a climate that rotted wood and rusted iron in months. The sound of the morning in the quiet corridors of the theater was the tuning of violins in a room where the humidity could reach 95%. This was El Dorado as a performance, a gilded city that actually existed, but was entirely dependent on a single commodity logistics that was inherently fragile. In simple terms, the quiet corridors of the forest became a site of total biological mobilization. The real tension lay in the extinction of the local. To fuel the rubber machine, thousands of indigenous people were forced into slave logistics, specifically in regions like the Putumayo. The deeper issue was the cost of the commodity. For every ton of rubber exported, the systemic human toll was measured in lives lost to exhaustion hunger, and brutality. What quietly determined the outcome of this dark era was the informational leakage. Just as the Spanish crown had eventually audited the conquistadors, the British and American public began to hear reports of the red rubber atrocities. The quiet corridors of the forest were no longer silent. They were filled with the echoes of an industrial-scale tragedy that the myth of El Dorado had always tried to ignore. Beneath all of this was the logistics of the seed. While the rubber lords felt invincible in their marble palaces, a systemic sabotage was underway. In 1876, a British explorer named Henry Wickham smuggled 70,000 heavier seeds out of the Amazon and delivered them to Kew Gardens in London. On the surface, this was an act of botanical theft, but at the core of the conflict was the end of the monopoly. The British were moving the logistics of production from the chaotic, wild harvest of the Amazon to the orderly, plantation logistics of Southeast Asia. The real tension was the time lag. It would take 30 years for those seeds to become a market-crushing force. During those decades, the Amazonian elite continued to spend as if the gilded city would last forever, unaware that the operating system of their wealth had already been copied and moved. As months passed into the early 1910s, the price collapse arrived with the suddenness of a tropical storm. In simple terms, the Asian plantations could produce rubber faster, cheaper, and more consistently than the wild tappers of the Amazon. The real tension lay in the institutional inertia. The cities of Manaus and Iquitos, built on the logistics of the mirage, had no backup plan. The deeper issue was the abandonment of the infrastructure. Almost overnight, the quiet corridors of the grand mansions were left to the spiders and the mold. The steamships stopped running, the opera house went dark, and the gilded age of the rubber barons ended in a logistical sovereign default. This was the final audit of the industrial El Dorado. It proved that wealth based on a single extracted resource is as ephemeral as a golden king in a lake. What truly shaped the outcome of the post-boom era was the reclaiming by the green. In simple terms, as the capital fled, the jungle moved back in. The real tension was the aesthetics of the ruin. From a distance, the rotting mansions of Manaus looked like the crumbling temples of an ancient civilization. The deeper issue was the survival of the tapper. While the barons left for Europe, the Seringueiros remained in the forest, their subsistence logistics returning to a state of quiet, localized endurance. The sound of the morning was once again the call of the birds and the drip of the rain, the industrial rhythm of the machete fading into the background of a forest economy that had outlived the empire of rubber. The real tension of the rubber boom's legacy lay in the environmental debt. At a superficial level, the trees were still there, but at the core of the conflict was the displacement of the species. The Amazon had been systemically altered by the paths, the camps, and the introduction of foreign diseases. The deeper issue was the loss of the indigenous archive. Whole cultures had been dismantled to serve the logistics of the tire. This was the moral friction of the new El Dorado, the realization that the search for wealth in the quiet corridors always comes at the price of the biological integrity of the landscape. As the sun sets over the Rio Negro today, the shadows of the rubber boom remain, a gilded dome in a sea of green, a reminder of the cost of turning the forest into a factory. In simple terms, the rubber era was the industrial translation of the El Dorado myth. The real tension of the morning, the struggle to tap the next tree, was the 19th century version of the struggle to find the next golden rock. The deeper issue was the persistence of the extraction mentality. Whether it was gold, cinnamon, or rubber, the systemic goal was always to take the wealth out of the jungle and move it to the city. The quiet corridors of the Amazon were never seen as a place to be, but as a place to mine. This was the fundamental logistical era of the European mind, and the gilded cities of the rubber boom were its most spectacular and tragic monuments. As the logistical sovereign default of the rubber boom left the great cities of the Amazon in a state of gilded decay, the search for El Dorado underwent its final, most obsessive pivot. On the surface, the 20th century should have been the era of the total map, where airplanes and radio would strip the quiet corridors of their remaining secrets. However, at the core of the conflict was the psychological persistence of the ruin. The deeper issue was that the failure to find a city of gold had not destroyed the myth, it had merely archaeologized it. The goal was no longer a city of living gold, but a lost city of stone, a prehistoric civilization that would prove the Amazon was not a green desert, but the cradle of an ancient, sophisticated empire. What truly shaped the outcome of this era was the arrival of Colonel Percy Fawcett, a man who functioned as the last conquistador of the Victorian age, fueled by a logistics of the occult and a desperate need to find his own version of El Dorado, which he simply called Z. The real tension of Fawcett's quest lay in the informational archive he had spent decades compiling. In simple terms, Fawcett was not a common treasure hunter. He was a highly trained surveyor and a recipient of the Royal Geographical Society's Founders Medal. But beneath all of this was his systemic rejection of the modern world. He believed that the Spanish had missed the gilded city because they lacked the esoteric knowledge to recognize it. He scoured the archives of Rio de Janeiro and London, finding a specific document, the manuscript 512, which described a magnificent stone city discovered by a Portuguese expedition in 1753. The real tension was the translation of the stone. To Fawcett, these were not just stories, they were a logistical blueprint. He believed that Z was located in the Mato Grosso region of Brazil, a territory so rugged and remote that the quiet corridors of the forest had protected it from the industrial extraction of the rubber era. Slowly, the logistics of the expedition moved from the scale of a small army to the scale of a minimalist strike. At a superficial level, this was a matter of cost, but at the core of the conflict was Fawcett's belief in the elite survivor. He argued that large expeditions were doomed to failure because they moved too slowly and consumed too many resources. Instead, he favored a biologically lean logistics, a group of 3 men moving with the speed and stealth of the indigenous tribes. The real tension lay in the selection of the crew. For his final, fatal 1925 journey, he chose only his son, Jack, and Jack's friend, Raleigh Rymel. This was a familial logistics, where trust and blood were expected to replace the systemic discipline of a professional military unit. As the morning mist rose over the Cuiabá River, the sound of their departure was not the roar of a steamship, but the quiet, rhythmic splashing of a single dugout canoe. What truly shaped the outcome of Fawcett's survival was the caloric strategy of the void. In simple terms, he planned to live off the land, carrying only the most essential tools, a sextant, a camera, and a few tins of concentrated meat. The real tension was the parasitic load. The Mato Grosso was a landscape of biological warfare on a microscopic level. Ticks, chiggers, and the dreaded invisible flies were constant companions. Beneath all of this was the nutritional collapse. As the months passed, the quiet corridors of the forest proved to be a caloric desert for those who did not understand its rhythms. Unlike the indigenous people who moved within the systemic flow of the seasons, Fawcett was an external body trying to force his way through the green wall. The deeper issue was his stoicism as a liability. He refused to admit that his young companions were suffering from infections and exhaustion, his intellectual relaxation into the myth blinding him to the physical reality of his squad's decline. In the background, the logistics of the message became the only link between the Z quest and the outside world. Fawcett had arranged for runners to carry letters back to civilization, creating a lagged narrative that kept the global public in a state of high-intensity anticipation. At a superficial level, this was a brilliant piece of marketing logistics. He had sold the rights to his story to North American newspapers to fund the trip. But the real tension lay in the final silence. When the last letter arrived from a place called Dead Horse Camp, the system of information suddenly flatlined. The quiet corridors of the forest had swallowed the signal. This silence created a systemic vacuum that was instantly filled by a new myth, the mystery of the lost colonel. For the next 50 years, the search for Z was replaced by the logistics of the search for Fawcett. The real tension of these rescue missions, over 13 of them, lay in the inverse discovery. In simple terms, while looking for Fawcett, explorers found more of the Amazon than Fawcett ever had. But beneath all of this was the cost of the rescue logistics. It is estimated that nearly 100 people died trying to solve the mystery of what happened to the three men. The deeper issue was the persistence of the hope. People believed Fawcett might have found the city and stayed there, or that he was living as a god among a lost tribe. This was the final form of the El Dorado delusion, the belief that the quiet corridors of the forest could hide a person, a city, or an entire civilization from the gaze of the modern world. It was a logistical denial of the airplane and the satellite. At this stage, the logistics of the archaeologist finally began to provide a data-driven resolution to Fawcett's dream. From a distance, it appeared that Fawcett was a total failure, a man chasing ghosts. However, at the core of the conflict was a strange sincerity. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, archaeologists like Michael Heckenberger began to use LIDAR, light detection, and ranging to scan the floor of the Xingu region, near where Fawcett disappeared. The logistics of the laser revealed something that the conquistadors and the rubber lords had never seen: the garden cities of the pre-Columbian Amazon. These were not stone cities of gold like Manoa or Z, but biological cities of interconnected villages, massive earthworks, and sophisticated canals. The deeper issue was that Fawcett had been right for the wrong reasons. The Amazon had been home to a sophisticated, large-scale civilization, but its systemic expression was not in the monuments of Europe, but in the logistics of the earth. They built with soil, timber, and water. What quietly determined the outcome of this new archaeology was the realization that the gilded city was actually a gilded ecosystem. The quiet corridors of the forest were not a wilderness, they were an abandoned garden on a continental scale. The real tension of the morning, the struggle to find the stone walls, was finally resolved by the realization that the walls were made of living plants and carefully managed soil. Fawcett's mistake was not his belief in the greatness of the Amazon, but his inability to see wealth in a form other than stone and metal. Slowly, the logistics of the Z myth shifted into its final, contemporary phase. In simple terms, the legend of Fawcett became the source code for the modern adventure aesthetic, influencing everything from Indiana Jones to the lost city of Z. At a superficial level, this is harmless entertainment, but at the core of the conflict is the persistence of the exoticization. The deeper issue is that by focusing on the lost city, we continue to ignore the living logistics of the modern Amazon. We treat the forest as a static archive of the past rather than a dynamic system of the future. The real tension of the morning is now the logistics of the satellite, tracking the illegal extraction of gold and timber that continues to haunt the quiet corridors of the forest. In simple terms, the search for Z was the final gasp of the 19th century mind. The real tension of the morning, the struggle to calculate the latitude with a wet sextant, was met by a spirit that refused to accept the transparency of the modern age. Fawcett wanted the world to be bigger and more mysterious than it was. He wanted the quiet corridors to be a sanctuary for a higher logic that the mechanical logistics of the city had forgotten. The deeper issue was that he found exactly what he was looking for. The forest became his permanent home, and his story became the final barrier between the myth and the reality. He didn't find Z, but he became the mystery that kept the quest alive for one more century. What quietly determined the outcome of the archaeological El Dorado was the shift from extraction to observation. In the background, the modern researcher does not want to take the gold out. They want to keep the information in the ground. This is the logistics of preservation. The real tension is the speed of the chainsaw versus the speed of the survey. The deeper issue is that the quiet corridors are now a managed system under threat from the very global trade that Humboldt helped facilitate. The gilded city of the 21st century is the standing forest, a system whose value in carbon logistics and biological diversity far outweighs any hoard of gold or rubber. As the sun sets over the Mato Grosso today, the Dead Horse Camp is just a coordinate in a database, a quiet corridor that has been measured and mapped 1,000 times. But the real tension of the morning remains, the human need for the unknown. The listener can feel the peace of a location that has been found and yet remains unsolved. The transition from the explorer to the archaeologist is complete, and the forest is no longer a green desert, but a document waiting to be read. The logistics of the mirage have faded, and the logistics of the soil are beginning. On the surface, the 21st century has finally conquered the quiet corridors of the Amazon with the ultimate logistical weapon, the satellite. It might seem that the search for El Dorado has reached its final, unceremonious conclusion, with every square meter of the basin indexed, tagged, and monitored by the global eye. However, at the core of the conflict between the digital and the physical is a new and even more complex systemic reality. The golden fever has not disappeared. It has merely evolved into the logistics of the digital frontier. The deeper issue is that the modern world still treats the Amazon as a resource vault, but the currency has changed. We are no longer looking for a gilded king or even a lost city. We are managing the carbon logistics and the genomic data of a system that is vital to the biological survival of the planet. What truly shaped the outcome of this final phase is the realization that the gilded city was never a destination, but a global operating system that we are only now beginning to understand. The real tension of the modern frontier lies in the logistics of the invisible. In simple terms, the new El Dorado is the vast, untapped library of biological information contained within the forest's DNA. At a superficial level, pharmaceutical companies and tech firms function as the new conquistadors, scouring the quiet corridors for the next miracle drug or the next bioengineered material. The deeper issue is the systemic extraction of data. Just as the Spanish extracted gold and the British extracted seeds, the digital age extracts sequences. This is a weightless logistics. The wealth is moved not by ships or porters, but by the fiber optic cables of the digital Silk Road. The real tension is the ethical friction. Who owns the genetic code of a plant that has been managed by indigenous people for 5,000 years? The sound of the morning is no longer the adze or the sextant, but the hum of the server and the quiet click of the sequencer. Slowly, the logistics of the gold has returned in a dark, localized form known as garimpo, the illegal small-scale mining that haunts the riverbanks. In simple terms, the price of gold in the global financial system continues to drive thousands of men back into the mud of the Tapajos and the Yanomami territories. The real tension lay in the technological paradox. These modern miners use hydraulic pumps and mercury, tools that are industrial-scale version of the conquistadors' pans. Beneath all of this is the mercury logistics. The deeper issue is that to find the gold, they are systemically poisoning the water system, turning the quiet corridors into a toxic wasteland. From a distance, the satellite sees the golden scars on the green canopy, a sensory reminder that the fever is still very much alive, even in the age of the internet. What truly shaped the outcome of the modern conservation effort is the logistics of the guard. In simple terms, the defense of the forest has become a high-tech warfare. Indigenous groups, once the victims of the logistics of the sword, have become the masters of the logistics of the drone. They use GPS and satellite imagery to track illegal incursions and report them to the global public in real time. This is the inversion of the map. The map is no longer a tool of the conqueror used to find the treasure. It is a tool of the inhabitant used to protect the home. The real tension of the morning is the flight of the drone over the canopy, a mechanical bird that provides a logistical shield for the quiet corridors. The deeper issue is the speed of the response. Can the bureaucratic logistics of the state move as fast as the extraction logistics of the illegal loggers? Beneath all of this is the logistics of the atmosphere. The real El Dorado of the 21st century is the Amazon's role as the carbon sink of the world. In simple terms, the wealth of the forest is now measured in its ability to not be consumed. The deeper issue is the carbon credit market, a financial logistics that attempts to put a price on the standing tree. The real tension lay in the abstract nature of the value. We are trying to pay the forest to breathe for us. This is a systemic entanglement where the economy of the quiet corridors is now directly linked to the economy of the smog-filled cities thousands of miles away. What quietly determined the outcome of this climatic gamble is the realization that if the forest reaches a tipping point, the entire logistical system of human civilization, our food, our water, our weather, will undergo a global default. At a superficial level, the search for El Dorado has ended. But at the core of the conflict, the psychology of the search remains. The deeper issue is that we are still looking for a magic solution to our systemic problems. We look to the Amazon to solve our climate crisis, just as the Spanish looked to it to solve their debt crisis. The real tension is the persistence of the extraction mindset. We have moved from gold to rubber to oil to data, but we are still taking rather than participating. This is the final logistical lesson of the 500-year quest. The system cannot survive if it only consumes. The quiet corridors are a living archive that teaches us that wealth is a state of systemic balance, not a hoard of metal. In the background, the digital El Dorado continues to grow. We have found the city, and it is made of pixels and data points. The real tension is the loss of the mystery. As events unfolded, we realized that the unknown was a vital psychological resource. By mapping everything, we have removed the sanctuary of the imagination that Fawcett and Raleigh once prized. The deeper issue is the requirement of the wilderness. A world without quiet corridors is a world without intellectual relaxation. We need the idea of the unfound to keep our own systems from becoming stagnant. The mirage was not a lie. It was a systemic prompt that pushed us to explore the limits of our world. Slowly, we reach the end of this long journey through the history of the Gilded One. We have seen the logistics of the fever, the logistics of the river, the logistics of the madness, and the logistics of the lens. At a superficial level, it is a story of failure, of men who sought gold and found only mud. But at the core of the conflict, it is a story of accidental discovery. By looking for El Dorado, we found the Amazon. We found the greatest river, the densest life, and the last hope of the planet's climate. The real tension of the battle was never with the environment, but with our own inability to see the value of the living. The quiet corridors of the forest remain still, but they are no longer empty of our presence. They are filled with our satellites, our sensors, and our anxieties. The real tension of the morning, the struggle for the future, is met by a new generation of explorers who are looking for sustainability rather than sovereignty. The transition from the conquistador to the steward is beginning, and the forest is waiting to see if we have finally learned the lesson of the lake and the city. The logistics of the search are over. The logistics of the survival have begun.